Okay, so we're ready to rock and roll, and I'd like to start by welcoming everybody. And I'm Pádraig Berry. I'm the CEO of TTI Success Insights here in Ireland. And on behalf of Derek, our guest today, and myself, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, Choosing Resilience in the Workplace. And it's sort of summarized there by what Carl Jung said, "I'm not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." And the word choosing in the title is really important. And it's going to be a big emphasis of what Derek, I think, is going to be talking about as we go through the webinar. So we have a large number, as usual. We usually get a good number on the webinars. So we have you all muted and the videos are off. If you want to communicate with me, please use the chat box and just pop your questions in there, and we'll address them at the end. So our objective today is to, it's really very simple. Three things, I suppose: explain what resilience is, emphasize, I suppose, why it's actually important, and then maybe give you some tips on how you can develop it in the workplace, how you can actually choose resilience at a personal level and at the level of the workplace. I mean, God only knows if we're facing into more COVID restrictions, but one thing is sure, people are feeling the pressure, and resilience is needed now more than ever. And it's not, and it's interesting, I mean, again, Jerry can be talking about this in his presentation, but I cogged a little bit from one of his slides. I just want to say, like, resilience is one's ability to respond and adapt to the pressures of daily life. This is what resilience is. It's not some sort of passive intrinsic characteristic. It's an active process. It's something we do, something we need to engage with. And we all approach it differently. We all get our strengths, if you wish, from different places, and we approach it differently and approach it different ways. And in this webinar, this is really what Derek is going to be focusing on. Why is resilience so important in our changing work lives? Because the world is changing. And there's what are some simple ways to build resilience in ourselves and in our workplaces. So let me start by introducing our guest speaker. So Derek starts as, well, he didn't start as, but he started his career in the sales field. He originally studied economics, which is sort of interesting. And that was his primary degree, then qualified in project management, teaching, which I didn't know, Derek, until I got your bio for this webinar.
Yeah, a failed teacher, Pádraig.
A failed teacher. Coaching, which I do know. And of course, you're trained in all the TTI Success Insights assessments and tools. And that's actually how you and I met. Yeah. And Derek started his current business, Sales Management Solutions, in 2019, after I think about 20 years in leadership in sales, as head of sales, field sales and customer care with Coca-Cola, and as head of sales and business resources with Cisco. And we all know how important resilience is in sales and in leading sales teams. And Derek has led like multiple teams across multiple markets, and indeed won, to the best of my knowledge, won many sales awards and engagement awards. And recently, or more recently, I should say, in your new role in sales and management solutions, you've worked with some on some leadership and change projects with big name organizations. I think Intel was one of them, Heineken. I know you did work with Enterprise Ireland, Primeline, to name some of them. So do you want to say hello, Derek?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Pádraig, and thanks. It's a great introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and I do appreciate everybody giving up their time. And I think you're right. I think there's it's a very topical area at the moment, and a very important area to discuss today. So I'm looking forward to going through a small deck with everybody, but hopefully a deck that's readily digestible and people can take actions from it fairly promptly, without having to go back and re-examine or study what we've done here today.
Good. In fact, at the end of this, anybody who wants the recording, we'll be posting the recording up on LinkedIn as usual. Or a link to it, and we'll be sending it out to those people who've registered. But if you want the slide deck, if you want actually the PDF of the slide deck and the notes, you just let us know, just email us, and we'll give you the details in either Derek or myself, and we'll shoot that off to you. So Derek, let's start. Yep. Let's rock and roll. And let me ask you a question. When you say choosing resilience. Why did you come up with this concept of choosing resilience? What was the background to it? Like, what is resilience from your perspective? How would you view it? And why did you end up with this thing of choosing resilience?
Yeah, thanks, Pádraig. Well, look, you know, I'll cover that in more detail as we progress, and you've touched on it in the introduction. But I suppose from my perspective, you're talking to companies over the last couple of years, and even, you know, everybody has come onto this call and this webinar this morning through LinkedIn. You know, we're bombarded with kind of competing agendas from different areas, and you know, everything is important and everything is urgent, and there's a hell of a lot of change out there. And if you look at what, you know, in between all that, we're really not very clear on a lot of the things we feel we should be clear on, and you'll see the prompt there on the screen in front of you. You know, this, where we've been everything, particularly in the last couple of years, from kind of lost, unsure, confused, and I would have said originally we were at a crossroads, but even this week in itself, it feels almost like it's a roundabout, that we're kind of back to where we started and we're going around in circles a bit. So, you know, business leaders, thought leaders, politicians, everybody is searching for certainty. Everybody's looking to settle on a path forward, and yet we're not always feeling that way. And so if you feel like one of those signposts is pointing directly at you this morning, I would say to you, don't feel concerned or don't feel alone. It's probably more of an indication that, you know, you're awake and you're highly aware of and where you should be. So that's probably the starting point for the team and for what we're doing here today. The scope of this is quite broad, and we could have gone in a lot of directions for the 40 minutes or for the time we have here today. But from my perspective and from your perspective, Pádraig, our expertise and what we can talk with some certainty about is the workplace. And we've looked, and we're going to begin looking at the backdrop of the workplace primarily, and then we'll make our way towards how resilience can play its part and be a great thing to embrace and choose, as per the title of the webinar in that regard. So the backdrop then with the changes in the workplace are many as they are long. And if I had probably asked, if I had sent out a questionnaire to the group that are here today, we would have come back with a long and not exhaustive list. But to start, you know, roles, responsibilities, and even structures have changed in many businesses over the last period. People have been asked to do more, people have been asked to do less, people have been asked to take on manager roles without manager titles. Structures have flattened. I spoke to somebody last week, and they couldn't understand a frontline individual working in the and couldn't understand why their senior manager was so interested now in talking to the customer these days, because the solutions that they had used for years had become slowly redundant with so many changes, and senior management wanted to get closer. So the behaviors hierarchies have flattened in a lot of companies, and a lot of things have changed. In between all that, and with a view to kind of surviving operationally and things have become usually operational, and things like learning and development have been parked, are certainly sidelined with no malintent, but just kind of the nature of where we are. Likewise, how people interact has changed dramatically. The fact that we're here on a communication forum, you know, is indicative of that. And of course that hasn't all been bad, in so much as you know, there's been huge merit. This group would never be together probably a couple of years ago, which is great. You know, if needs and consumer needs have changed as well with all that, so that's all ends up being reflected in the workplace, in objectives, in how people work, how processes are followed. and ultimately it'll end up somewhere in the company financials, and that in itself creates its own dynamic. At the far end of that continuum, there will be job security, or job insecurity, should I say, and all of the negative behaviors that potentially could come with that. I then wanted to introduce this idea of presenteeism in the workplace, and I know a couple of friends of mine are on this webinar, or people, old work colleagues of mine that are in the HR space. They'll be highly aware of this at this point in time, and it kind of sits there as the big brother of with absenteeism. And what it is this idea of people arriving to work in suboptimal health, and it manifests with some of those words we put on the screen for you, in your fatigue, stress, anxiety, and general lack of energy in the workplace.
Doesn't this, Derek, doesn't this get back to this concept, the comment we made just before we start, the difference between mental health and mental illness, that this whole presenteeism is really talking about mental health issues, as opposed to mental illness issues. You're feeling down, you're feeling exhausted, you're feeling burnt out, you're feeling fed up, you're feeling whatever you're feeling. And it ends up, I mean, it actually ends up with people not being able to get out of bed. They're not mentally ill, but they're not mentally well either. They're actually suffering from mild forms of whatever. And it's very alive. It's very, I know even at a personal level, we're all working remotely now. We're all standing here. I'm standing here in my office, working remotely with all my equipment. I talk to people all the time online, but I don't see too many people. We don't have this interaction in the office. We don't have any of these kind of things, So I mean, your comment about the tip of the iceberg, I think, was very, very sort of
and 100%, Pádraig. And only this week I was talking to someone myself, and we were discussing conflict in the workplace, and he said he finds dealing with conflict dealing with challenging issues in the workplace difficult virtually. So, under normal circumstances, everything works perfectly, but the minute there's a problem in the system, he finds things difficult to deal with. But the point on the iceberg, if I can hold that thought for a minute, the point is it's not seen. We'll know if someone is absent from the workplace, but typically people can present themselves in the workplace as I am here on the screen. I can present myself. You can rehearse for 45 minutes or an hour, or you can turn up at your meeting and look, in perfectly good working order, but you turn off your camera and you could be flattened thereafter. So a lot of the kind of behavioral cues that you would typically observe in the workplace, and those opportunities to nip potential conflict in the bud, are being missed, and they go unobserved and potentially fester. The same guy I was talking to this week had a staff of 20, 10 of which he's never met in person. He even had staff that had started in the last year and left again in the last year, and he'd never met them in person. So, that's, look, with the best of intentions too, and the people on this call will have had experiences like this. With the best of intentions, that's a very difficult space to be in. Now, we are catching up a bit, and towards some companies have, began the putting a focus on this. And like I said, some of the HR guys on the call will know well.
You said to me, Derek, 1 in 3, I think you said to me earlier. Yeah. 1 in 3 companies are addressing this. The stats are kind of 9 and 10 are actually aware of it when they consider it, but actually 1 in 3 are actually doing something, or 3 in 10, or a third are actually doing something about it. And to be honest with you, and this list is not exhaustive, but you'll see at the bottom, it's not a major issue. It's not being taken usually seriously at a board level based on the stats. This is a CIPD survey, and there's some very good work done by RAND Europe and Deloitte in this space that people can check them out. You can Google them, get them online. But
even what we're looking at here, I mean, 50% of the actions taken here is actually sending people home.
Yeah.
So you could debate that that's not an action at all. You could swap your presenteeism for absenteeism. So, you know, look, but as companies become more insight-led and data-led, this can be tracked. And I know, Parag, you had said that to me as well, that you had met somebody in the last period that was kind of beginning a new system of tracking some of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually talking to somebody just yesterday, incredibly, and they were talking about new systems, AI systems that actually can monitor people's interaction. So people working at desks, for example, like what they're typing, language they're using, and so on and so forth, to try and identify triggers or markers, if you wish, to identify people who are beginning to feel stress, for example, and which I find fascinating. Because I think it's really, really important. I always find it interesting. You know, we talk about obesity, for example. We talk about people carrying extra weight, and we talk about the need to get out there and all these campaigns about your diet, about your exercise, whatever. There's almost nothing, except when you see some of the Irish Times or whatever, now and again, somebody comes out and said they've mental health issues and tries to bring it into the public domain. There's very, very little talked about this. And I think people experience a lot of stress. There's a lot of stuff going on there that's not really discussed. So that leads into your next slide there. You talk there about the stress scale.
Yeah.
How to explain this, Jerry?
Some people may have come across this as the pain scale before, but I think it kind of ties in with that iceberg piece a bit about what's observed and what's understood and what do people really have an appreciation for. But Parag, in your case, if I was to typically ask you, you know, or if people on the call, even if you can just take a second to reflect on it, you know, where do you think, you know, stress should be? 10 being high stress and 0 being no stress. Where would you like to be? And Parag, I'll ask you, I mean, that question, because you're live there.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say somewhere in the middle, actually. But I'm going to think that people typically would say down around 0. But I'm going to say somewhere in the middle, because I've actually read stuff on this. And so and I know, in fact, that we require a certain amount of stress for performance.
Yeah,
am I right?
My little Lego men would be absolutely, they would be highlighting the conventional wisdom on this is, you know, I'd love zero stress in my life, of course. And you mentioned the fitness piece a minute. I often refer to this, and if you can move on to the next slide, I often refer to this as the idea of going to the gym. You wouldn't go to the gym and invest an hour of your time, lift and go in and find the lightest weights you can find in the gym and lift them for an hour and go home without breaking a sweat. You wouldn't do that, because it creates no tension on the muscle. It develops no strength. It develops no growth, and it
develops no resilience.
Exactly. So it's so the optimal, the new wisdom on it is that you really should be somewhere in the middle, or kind of that 6, 7, 8 space, where you're under a little bit, you're under some stress, developing that growth, stretching yourself. On the left-hand side of the continuum, which is kind of the 0, 1, 2, 3, if you're there and you're under no stress at all, well, then you need to get some new goals in your life. You need to start stretching what you're doing. If, however, you're on the other end of the continuum, and you're, to use the gym analogy, you're in the gym, you're trying to lift weights that you can't lift, well, then you potentially need some support. So it's a very clear concept, and if for anybody that's, you know, in a position of coaching staff, it's a very simple tool to use to kind of establish where do they think they are, and bring them into recognition.
I like that a lot, Derek, because actually I really do like that a lot, and because I'm a great believer in the concept of goals and targets. Not that you get wedded to them and they dominate your life, but the need for some feeling of direction, some feeling of I have something that I'm trying to accomplish. There's a great old expression: when you're feeling listless, make a list. And I've always liked it because I think it's very, very true. When you're feeling listless, decide what it is you want to do. And it's one of the rules for mental health, by the way. In Do It Yourself Psychotherapy by Shepherd, a wonderful, wonderful book. Anybody gets a copy of it, well worth reading. And these 20 exercises for mental health. But this is one of them. And so this idea of actually setting goals, setting objectives, deciding what it is that you want to do, what you want to accomplish, and moving towards that, that alone builds motivation. That alone builds energy. That alone sort of gets you out of this rut of feeling directionless, or feeling stressed, because you're not in control. For example, the idea of trying to be in control, I think, is important.
And we will cover some of that, Pádraig, in the common slides as well.
Okay.
But it's so the facts are, all the change is there. Some people have thrived in that chaos, but many haven't. And there's pressure building in that uncertainty, and it's not always observable as it is with the image on the screen. It's not always observable, and sometimes we have to dig deeper and stand back and reflect and try and evaluate. How does it present itself in the workplace? And
so how does it? I mean,
yeah.
What can we? I mean, what should we expect to see in the workplace?
The quick answer is, people will present stress in atypical behavior, and behavior that's kind of a catch-all answer. But breaking that down, what does that actually look like? Coming downwards from a leader, it may look like unrealistic expectations, kind of demanding expectations that aren't not smart objectives, not reasonably time bound, not realistic. That, of course, you'll have the whole area of poor communication, and some of that will be tied in with that emotional swings. Whether it be anger, people being dismissive in the workplace. So there can be lots of different ways that shows up. It'll also show up in that whole focus around on self, and the I'm all right, Jack brigade, and I mentioned there's insecurity in the system, and people are worried about the certainty of their job. People will begin to feather their own nests and try and protect their own patch a little bit, and rather than the team. Not unusual in the workplace, and again, people on this call will have or witnessed some of that, I'm sure, over time. Some of the normal best practice things like feedback, and support, balls like that will be dropped. I mentioned learning and development at the beginning of the call, but generally there will be a kind of prevalence of short-term thinking, that lack of energy you spoke about, and then, of course, in our virtual world, it isn't unusual, and a lot of clients, customers I speak to, have kind of witnessed the kind of evolution of the virtual silos, and people being able to meet virtually and leave other people out of the debate because they are all doing it. They're doing it remotely now, of course. So lots of things. So the question for us, and to try and hang some actions on some of the landscape that where we've kind of outlined, is how do we make the leap then from that kind of point of exhaustion and stress? How do we make the leap to a point of resilience? And there's lots of areas to do that. But look, the obvious place to start is let's kind of clean the slate and define what exactly is resilience, and that's really what we want to do today, to define that. And then this idea of choosing resilience, let's just explore that as a group for the time we have here this morning. So go ahead there, Pádraig. It's so resilience, the kind of definition of resilience is that ability to kind of respond to the daily pressures of life. And in the context of this call, I'm going to say working life, in that we were kind of not taking into scope what's brought in that. It's not a passive or intrinsic characteristic. And this is the point, and this is how I've landed on the choosing resilience idea. It has to be engaged with. Now, and I don't want to sound anyway blasé about that. I understand people, you know, it's not a flick of a switch. And Pádraig, you intimated earlier that, you know, you don't always feel your strength or find your strength. We're not, we're not robots. It's not that you flick a switch and everything, okay, I've made that decision, I'm going to be resilient, and all of a sudden you're resilient. It is a process that has to be worked on. And I don't want to lessen or intimidate anybody by thinking it's anything else than that. We're all, we can all have frail moments or moments when we're not feeling our best. But we have to, once we have an appreciation that we need to make choices in that regard, that's a great place to start. And of course, we all do that in different ways. And I'll cover that. We have a small slide put in on behaviors later, and how people will make those decisions differently according to their behavioral profiles. But it begins for me, and there are some kind of accepted pillars of resilience. But for me, there's kind of a foundation to those pillars first. And that foundation is really around the idea of accepting that life isn't perfect, that you don't always win, and it isn't always fair. And once you have that kind of awareness, and people, and Pádraig, I know we've spoken about this, and people, some people will bring this to a level where they practice mindfulness, and they do their meditation and find that their gratitude for what they have and an acceptance for what they have, and that's a very important piece. But for me, just taking it down and to its simplest form, we need to start knowing that we can't win all the time, and it's not always going to be perfect. Now that doesn't mean, and I have the books behind me here on my own shelf about how to make $1 million and how to be a winner all the time and all that stuff. So we all have the books. There's lots of self-help books out there and lots of popular psychology out there that tells us we can all be amazing all the time. But the reality is it has to be engaged with and it has to be chosen. And that's the kind of core message from the title of the webinar.
Derek, I want to jump in for a second, if I may, Derek. Because you use a word there that I'm a great believer in. So you talked about the word, you use the word gratitude. And I'm a great believer in the gratitude principle. On the simple basis that, and my mom years ago, she used to say to me, instead of because I was always very ambitious, and instead of looking up all the time, Pádraig, look down and look at how much more successful, or how much better off, or how much more luckier you are than other people, and be grateful. And of course, I never was as a young man. I've learned it as I've got older. But this concept of the gratitude principle is sort of and these are one of the things that we talk about in this area of being active, that this is not an intrinsic thing, this is something you engage with. The way you explain things to yourself, the way you think about things is really important. So if you were saying, oh my God, this, that, and the other happened, as opposed to, I have this, I have that, I have these loving relationships, I have this, a home, a roof over my head, I have food on the table. I always feel laugh when I see people that all these first world problems that people are challenged with. And I lived in the third world. I lived in like lots of interesting places over my life. I've seen people literally lying down the side of the road and dying of starvation, literally. And when you see that, and you see the way a lot of people live, you realize how lucky we are. So that explanatory style, change the way you think about things, the way you describe things. Yourself. Journaling, for example, I think you mentioned that at some stage later on. Journaling is really important, in helping you to get a sense of perspective and a sense of what is working, and that life isn't always fair, it isn't always perfect. You're so right. But I think that concept of gratitude is a really important one for me, at least. Yeah,
no, 100%. And so that's the foundation. And then we look at the accepted pillars of resilience, and you'll find slight variations to this. And some people separate self-care, which I'll discuss in a second. They'll separate self-care into emotional and psychological, and they can break it up. But for me, typically it can be captured in these 4 pillars, and they're self-care, self-awareness, relationships, and purpose. And briefly on each of those, self-care is that idea of, you know, involving yourself in activities that support your health, your well-being, and that can be physical, mental, it can be spiritual, psychological. It's quite broad, but you try, and if we consider it in the workplace, try and come to work in with the best version of yourself, ready for the day. Like I said, it's not a slam dunk. It has to be worked on. It has to be engaged with, but it's there. The other piece is self-awareness, and we've touched on it there, that piece about gratitude, but it's that idea of being able to interpret your own behavior, interpret your own feelings, and interpret your own actions in an objective way. And being able to stand back and say, okay, do you know something? That's a blind spot of mine. That's something I can work off. That's something that would that's having that understanding of how you're perceived or experienced by others. The third one then is that idea of relationships, you know, arguably self-explanatory, but it's important to have diverse relationships, you know, with individuals and groups, and it's important to try and have more than one voice in your world, and get, you know, get competing opinions on things, so that you can you know, test your convictions and test your ideas, and you know, and test your awareness around yourself, even to tie back in with the previous point. And the last one then is that idea of purpose. And purpose is, you know, to be clear, that's not a set of objectives that your boss gave you. You know, that's not purpose. It might be, you know, listen, it can be very valid, of course, and it can be very rewarding to receive them and get the associated bonus with it. But purpose is the reason which something is done, or the reason something exists. And so it's quite a, you know, again, we could do a webinar for 45 minutes on purpose and what it means. But it's having that purpose and understanding your purpose and understanding where you're taking value from on a personal level. And so they're the pillars built on our foundation of, you know, gratitude and accepting that, you know, something, it might not always work and it might not always work out right, but that's our foundation. They're our pillars. And then we look at how do we actually practically build that into the workplace. And there's various different ways of doing that, but, you know, clearly it will start with practicing optimism, trying to see challenges as opportunities. You know, if we link back to that piece about relationships, it'll involve sharing with others, and that old adage about a problem shared is a problem halved. It can be very true, and true in the workplace as anywhere else. That idea of not taking failure personally, trying to learn new things, again, go back to that stress model, trying to stretch yourself a little bit, even in a learning way, trying to stretch your learning and add on more, and find strength in doing that, and generally build from what you're good at. And I say that because there's 4 pillars there, and just for your own sanity, you know, it's okay to be working on one of them. You know, if we come off of this webinar and we say, okay, I'm going to focus on the self-care piece as a priority for myself, or I'm going, you know, in an ideal world, of course, you have the 4 of them working like clockwork, and you're very focused on the 4 of them. But you don't, you know, you need to be part of that gratitude piece. Be kind to yourself. You know, pick one of them and try and get some momentum from that and build from there. That's the advice I would give to people. And again, I you know, I'd say that from a personal perspective. And the last piece, and you've touched on it already, Pádraig, is documenting your successes. I'm not sure, and again, I would say people on this call, you know, you wonder, are you going to apply for a job? And then you're not so sure. and then you look at the job description and you're not so sure. And the next thing, you start building your CV, and then all of a sudden you realize, wow, I am actually amazing. I didn't realize I did so many things, and this, that, and the other. And all of a sudden, that's just a very simple example of documenting successes, but it's a very practical example. And very often people have said that to me in coaching sessions, that when they actually wrote it down, they found there was real strength in it. The CV.
Actually, I like that a lot. Actually, I like these a lot, Derek, and I want to make a couple of comments on them. The first one, seeing challenge as opportunity. Going back to that book I mentioned earlier, Use Yourself Psychotherapy by Shepard. He talks about learning to interpret your anxiety as excitement. Again, I mentioned explanatory style, how you explain things to yourself. So developing these ways of explaining things. So you're feeling anxious, you're feeling stressed about something. Interpret that as anxiety. Just try it as an experiment, and you'll realize it has a direct impact on what you're feeling. You can change what's happening here by changing what's happening here. And you change what's happening here by describing it differently to yourself. So a little loop there that you can build that's sort of interesting. I like to think of don't take failure personally. There's a great book called The 4 Agreements. And in the 4 agreements, he said the 4 agreements are be impeccable with the word, don't take anything personally, don't make assumptions, and always do your best. And I always like the don't take anything personally one. And he would argue, the guy's name was Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, and he would argue that any feedback, anything you get is just somebody's opinion, it's just their perspective, and quite often it's just a projection of their own reality. And so it's not just about failure. I think anything that's happening, don't take it personally, try and detach from it. Again, it's a way of looking at it and say, well, that's their point of view, or that's just what happened, it just is. I like, and I also particularly like the one of documented success. I'm a huge believer in this. I mean, I often ask people in coaching sessions, Derek, I'll ask them a question: how do you know you're being successful? Because you've no goals, you've no objectives, you've no targets. And the great definition of success. Success is the progressive realization of a predetermined, worthwhile personal goal. It's a thing of the present moment. I.e., I set a goal and I'm ticking the box. I'm doing the things that will get me there. And by doing these things, it raises your motivation. You say, I am being successful. Success isn't somewhere you arrive. Get back to your comment about all of this, that this is something we engage with. This is not something intrinsic or characteristic. This is something we engage with. The same is true of success and motivation. You don't arrive somewhere and be a success, or arrive somewhere and you're motivated. You're doing things, you're taking steps, you're engaging, and you're doing these things that help you build motivation by building success. So I think these things are really simple, but I think they're really, really important. I'm a huge believer. And even to learn new things, just go on YouTube and watch a clip on meditation, watch a clip on whatever, and start to develop new process. I think they're really, really good. I really like those headings that you've there. Very, very good.
Yeah, the other piece then, of course, Pádraig, is and adjusted. We have a diverse group on the call, and it is for everyone. This idea of choosing resilience is not. It's not a subject that just needs to be engaged with at an individual level, and there is a responsibility as leaders as well. And so I've put a couple of slides together, just splitting them into both what an individual can do and what a leader can do. And the sweeping, the obvious kind of sweeping thing to do is you go back to your 4 pillars, and you look at the 4 pillars and you go, yeah, well, try and engage and reflect on those pillars and bring those. But as an individual, you would expect to develop relationships, practice that self-care, good health, be clear in your purpose, be realistic, have perspective, all the things we've just spoken about, practicing self-awareness and looking at those innate strengths. The change piece we probably haven't covered, which is that idea that part of the acceptance is accept that change is going to happen as well, and we need to become comfortable with what's uncomfortable in a lot of cases, and that has been a pressing reality, obviously, in the last couple of years, but it exists that need existed long before COVID or anything with COVID. From a leader's perspective, and I would say this particularly to the leaders on the group, it's not okay just to be resilient in your own head and say, okay, I feel great, everything's fine. you have a responsibility to share your resilience and inspire it in others if you're in that leadership position. And of course, you can do that across a peer group. You can lead laterally, and you can lead without authority if you're not in a position where you have direct reports. Leadership can take on a couple of forms in that regard. But my key point on this would be, just because you have it, don't take it for granted for everybody else. So yes, they'll be positive in the face of adversity. They can dispel doubts for others. They can distill challenges into opportunities, but encourage that responsiveness, teamwork, set the standard. We spoke about how stress shows up in the workplace earlier, and it can show up in erratic communication or emotional swings. Well, if you're leading a group, well, you need to set the standard for that and set the standard for good communication. And of course, you need to be the embodiment of self-care and self-awareness where you can be.
And here comes the opposite. I think this is
yes.
This is what we pretend, isn't this? Yeah. This is what we pretend is.
There are a couple, and this is a survey of one in my case. I've come up with this list on my own and this concept, but there are resilience pretenders out there, and it's not unusual for habits and traits to be presented as resilience. And we need to be mindful of these and challenge them in others. And some examples of these, and I'm sure that people can reflect on it, they can come up with their own examples. But the examples of these are, the person who works longer hours than everybody else, to demonstrate just how committed they are and how strong they are and how resilient they are. But in fact, what they're really doing is diminishing their self-care and self-awareness over a long period of time. Now, we all understand and appreciate, and I've done it myself, that you need to peak for certain events, or you might be heavily involved in a project that requires extra effort and longer hours, and may expect that of others. But as a rule of thumb, there has to be that balance in your life. The other one then, of course, is being direct as a kind of a badge of honor, as I would call it, to people who are, well, I'm very black and white, and if you're not on my team, you're not, you're not with me, you're against me, and this, that, and the other. And then that can often manifest in very public ways, with people criticizing others in across team meetings and what have you. Or
it's interesting, Jerry, when I'm looking at that. The working long hours, everybody else, we all know that one. But the other two, being direct, a badge of honor and criticizing others. I mean, you talked about awareness as one of the pillars of resilience, and this is a complete lack of awareness, isn't it? At a personal level, and at an intrapersonal and an interpersonal level. People thinking that being direct, being bang in your face, that somehow or other, this is what resilient people do, and that we're all tough and we all man up and so on, and criticize the other. You should be able to take it, suck it up, this kind of thing. You hear these expressions, and of course, this shows a complete lack of awareness and a complete lack of, in fact, your next slide, what you're going to talk about here, a complete lack of the fact that people have different behaviors, driving forces, competencies, and so on and so forth, and respond differently to what I'm looking for, to the way you interact with them as a leader.
And that's our kind of our closing couple of slides are building it back into our. Myself and yourself, of course, will know the DISC model, but the science of it is that people's behavioral profile can be defined across 4 areas. One is, how do they deal with problems? Secondly, how they deal with people. Third, how they deal with pace. And fourth, how they deal with procedures. And if I go back to finding that idea of finding our strength, somebody that has a high approach to problems, well, they will most likely take actions and find strength in taking an action.
Yeah.
Because, inertia or hesitation doesn't work for them. They will invariably take an action and find strength. Other people, to find strength, will immediately include others and look for others and look for conversation, look for dialogue, and find their optimism and their strength through others. Others then will look towards the speed or the pace of things, and they'll try and slow things down so that they can, breathe and learn how to take things in at a pace that suits them. And then lastly, others will look for data and insights and they'll look for procedures, and they'll find strength in the certainty that that brings. So we're all a blend of all these things, of course, but we do have tendencies to pull or drive towards one of them particularly.
Yeah,
and that's kind of within that self-awareness space, of course, Pádraig.
Yeah, it's interesting, Derek. You know, one of the things that we did at the very beginning of the COVID, the pandemic, was we provided this a free report called the Working from Home Report. It's still available to anybody who wants it. And the idea of that was to help people understand that they had a predominant style, and they would see the world, and they would respond to what was happening as a consequence, and that other people would respond differently, and how to manage that interaction. I mean, a good example, I know lots of people who have an S here, for example, in the DISC model, who have an S here that's quite high, and they actually really like the pace, like working the routine, like working from home. They're actually very, very comfortable with it. Yeah. And other people, for example, the person over here is all about the high I, who's all about interacting with people, that outgoing, gregarious person, has found it incredibly stressful. And I think that's really important. And I also like your idea of strengths. I think that's a really important point. Knowing, again, getting back to the idea of the 4 pillars, and this thing of self-awareness, you know, knowing what your strengths are, building on strengths. I mean, the self-care for somebody like me, for example, who's got a G is way up there somewhere. For somebody like me, self-care is about going for a run, or chopping wood. It's physical exercise, it's activity, it's doing things, it's building lists. For somebody else, self-care might be going to meet a friend for a cup of coffee. So they're quite different things, and it's important to understand these.
Yeah. So that kind of brings, and actually the last and concluding slide was that reminder of.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So to kind of bring us around full circle, Pádraig, we've kind of set the scene. We've kind of painted the background of the workplace, the changes in the workplace. We've introduced that idea of presenteeism. We've introduced that idea of the stress scale, and then we've looked at resilience and the foundations of it. That idea of gratitude at the bottom, and that idea of accepting where we are, building our pillars on that. And then we've looked at some of the other elements around behaviors and how to choose your resilience. And I put the Carl Jung, you'll know, and some people on this call will know that Carl Jung was kind of the founding father of much of that behavioral stuff we've just discussed. And this quotation from him is 100 years old. Carl Jung was, alive and well around 100 years ago or so. And that's why I went back from listening to customers, talking to clients, and like I said, from looking at a lot of competing agendas on LinkedIn and the social media. It seemed to me that somehow there was a new and accepted understanding that resilience was a new thing that was somehow just needed since COVID. Resilience was needed 2,000 years ago, and it was needed when Carl Jung was around 100 years ago. And his quotation ties in perfectly with what we're doing. You know, it'll always be important, and there'll be a new need for it, and there'll always be a need for it as we progress. But that kind of brings us full circle. I hope it was useful for everybody. I hope, as I said at the beginning, that it was digestible in the hour that we've given it, and that we haven't given people exercises to do after it. And like I said, we can share, of course, the presentation for those who want to reach out to Pádraig or myself.
That was Derek. So on behalf of everybody who attended number one, I want to thank you. That was really good. I mean, really, really good. I genuinely, and I thought your deck was very, very good, and it flowed very nicely. It makes sense. The whole thing makes sense to me. Those pillars make sense. And again, I want to pick up on one comment you made. You talked about giving yourself a break. I think I thought being gentle with yourself or something.
I'm talking to myself.
Yeah, I know the feeling. I do know the feeling, actually. And but I just want to make a comment on that. And the comment is and we always say, what was the best time to plant a tree? And of course, the answer is 20 years ago. And the second best time to plant a tree is today. And I think if I was giving anything into this or advising anybody on this, I'd say the secret is to start building resilience and to pick a thing, not 20 things, to pick a thing. I'm a great believer in journaling. And let me rephrase that. I'm a recent 2-year-old believer in journaling. People were trying to get me to journal all my life. I always resisted. And then somebody gave me this beautiful leather bound. One of my VAAs gave me, Michelle, gave me this beautiful leather bound journal, and I get a refill for every year. And I started filling it in. But what was interesting for me about it was I started picking one thing, like I wanted to get my meditation back on track. So I put up there, and every day I had to tick it twice on the top of the journal. And then when I got that working, I said, I need to get my running back on track. And then it was something else, then it was my diet and so on. And slowly but surely, one at a time, I started rebuilding these resilience mechanisms, if you wish, that worked for me, that played to my strengths. So this idea, I think, of picking something and saying, I'm going to give this a month, I'm going to run with this for a month, and then picking another thing and slowly but surely building it, I think is a really good approach to it. Any comments, Derek?
Yeah, no, listen, yeah, look, I mean, I've summarized it, so I'm happy to have you bolt on that at the end. Absolutely. It's for me, that's, it'll fall into the everything will fall back into those 4 pillars ultimately. But you said start by planting one tree. I had said start by picking one of the pillars, and be kind to yourself. Don't be overwhelmed with that, so start small and build on that. Absolutely agree with you.
So that's it. Well, with that, we'll wrap it up. And again, I thank everybody for attending. I hope you found it useful. We got some good feedback there from people, so I appreciate that. Thanks a lot, Derek. Thanks for all the work you put into preparing this. Really, really helpful. And thanks for sharing.
No problem, Corey. And thank you. Good luck, everybody. And thanks for coming.
Okay. Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye.